Good evening. Uh, I'm Bob Shrum, the Warschaw Professor of Politics here at USC and Director of the Unruh Institute of Politics. I hope you will join us not only tonight, but in subsequent Tuesdays for our series with procon.org, a nonpartisan organization devoted to balanced, fact-based analysis of controversial issues. As it says, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. Next week, same time, same place, we'll be focusing on America's shrinking middle class. In the meantime, I will be joined by Matt Makoviak for a political conversation this Thursday, September 14th at 4 p.m. at the Herxlock's Room in Doheny Library. He worked in the George W. Bush administration as a conservative communications and campaign consultant. I will also be joined by someone who, perhaps improbably, has been a friend of mine for many decades, David Keene, the former president of the National Rifle Association and the American Conservative Union, for another political conversation next week, Monday, September 18th at 4 p.m. in the Ronald Tudor Campus Center, 450. We're partnering on that with the Political Student Assembly. We're also holding a new electorate conference on September 28th, which will delve into age and gender gaps, racial divides, and millennial voters. It will be held from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the Ronald Tudor Campus Center. RSVP for part of it or all of it on Eventbrite. In conjunction with our events, as I noted earlier, Procon is hosting debates on the same topic the day before at the Santa Monica Pier, Mondays from 6 to 7 p.m. through October 2nd. And to start off the evening, I'd like to introduce Kami Akavan, who is the director of Procon, to share a few words. That, by the way, they had a bomb scare last night at the Santa Monica Pier, so the event wasn't held.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, thank you for the introduction. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I want to thank everybody who is here physically today at USC. Thank you so much for participating in this discussion. This is a really, really important topic. Not enough people are talking about it in our country, and I'm so glad and honored that we are joined by a very esteemed national panel of VIPs here to help us understand these topics, break them down, make these complex issues not feel so complicated, and most of all, illustrate that people can disagree without being disagreeable. Hashtag civil discourse. That is what this event series is all about. We have a sponsor, Arthur N. Roop Foundation. We're grateful to them for funding so much of the events that will be taking place over the next 4 weeks. The event tonight is, you're here live. However, we are joined by tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people, who will be watching from a live YouTube feed, from a live Facebook feed. We're doing a video recording, which will then be posted online, and of course, C-SPAN is here. So for all of you watching on your mobile devices or at home, we welcome you as well. And without further ado, I want to turn it back to our esteemed panel here so we can benefit from their insights. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, let me introduce our panelists. Ralph Neas, former executive director of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. He's run dozens of national campaigns with bipartisan majorities to strengthen and protect civil rights laws during the Reagan and Bush presidencies. He's been very active since then, and he's been a friend of mine for about 37 years. Leslee Sherrill is the former president of ABC News, a fellow of the Unruh Institute of Politics, is working on a nonpartisan initiative, the Democracy Project, which focuses on electoral reform with Ralph. She formerly worked as a White House staffer and at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. Pete Peterson is the Dean and Senior Fellow at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. He was the 2014 Republican candidate for California Secretary of State. Had he run in another state, he might have succeeded. Trevor Potter, the former chairman of the United States Federal Election Commission, the former attorney for Senator John McCain and President George H.W. Bush, I assume not at the same time, the founder, president, and general counsel of the Campaign Legal Center, which is working in areas of campaign finance and elections, political communication, and government ethics. I have a superb co-moderator, Adam Grushin, who's the vice president of Unruh Associates, our student group. It's a standalone student group, but we're very proud to be associated with them. He's a senior here at the University of Southern California, and he's going to kick it off with the first question, which all of you can take a whack at.
Well, first off, thank you for being here. I think we all really appreciate it as students, hearing from you guys and hearing your expert opinions and thoughts on such an important issue. What I'm interested in is the fact that we've tried to reform the Electoral College for over 60 years. We've proposed, I think, over 700 amendments, and they've all failed. Is this tenable? Can we reform the college? What are your thoughts?
Who wants to go first?
Want me to take the initial crack?
Sure.
First of all, I do want to thank everybody involved. This is an extraordinary opportunity, and I think all of us are trying to figure out ways to address the extreme partisanship and the extreme polarization, unfortunately, in this country right now. And this first question is related to that. There's no question there's a strong bipartisan majority that wants to do something about the Electoral College. The problem is, and I was in law school the last time there was a significant effort to abolish the Electoral College and have direct vote. And there were two presidential candidates in favor of it. There were bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate. Problem is our checks and balances, and you need filibuster proof in the Senate on something that controversial. And it takes 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states. That's a virtual impossibility on any issue that I can think of right now in the United States, passing that kind of constitutional amendment. That does not mean, however, that we can't try to reform the Electoral College in the sense of how the electors vote. And there are many ways of looking at this, and I don't want to filibuster because we can go through all of them. But many of us would like the direct vote. If we can't get it, and I don't think we can do maybe the National Popular Vote Compact, which 11 states have already adopted, totaling 165 electoral votes. And what they're saying is they're passing a law in these states that if there is a candidate, and there will be, that has got the most votes, they will commit their electors to that candidate who has the most votes.
No matter whether or not the electors carry their state.
Exactly. And once they get to 270, their state laws would become active because, of course, 270 is how many votes you need in the Electoral College. There are other ways of doing this. For example, proportional representation. And a lot of us feel very strongly that would be a great way to go. So if you get 45% a presidential candidate in a particular state, you get 45% of the electors. The problem with that, and it would increase voter participation. I think it would help with respect to polarization and partisanship, but it can be gamed. For example, if California was proportional representation and 45%, 55%, whatever it might be, but Texas decides not to do it, and all of the votes in Texas go to a particular candidate, then the Democrats in this case would be at a disadvantage. But you can turn it around, and Texas does proportional representation, but California doesn't. And then the Democrats in California are at a disadvantage. So those are two of the ways. There are others, I'm sure, that will be discussed. But we should continue to talk about reform of how these electors come about. And there have to be ways, and I think there are several ways, and we'll discuss them later in addition to what I've talked about, that could work.
I am very hopeful, despite all of the efforts that have gone unsuccessfully in the past. I think when you end up with the fifth election where the popular vote and the Electoral College don't meet, perhaps the climate is right. People will be ready to make a change. I agree with Ralph, a constitutional amendment is just not realistic or feasible. But the states can do something. All the power with what happens to those Electoral College votes are in the hands of the states. Most of the states have turned them over to their political parties. In fact, I tried to call both parties to get a list of who voted on my behalf in the state of California, and I got put on hold and transferred around and sent back to the Secretary of State, to which I said, well, that's fine, but you actually picked these electors. I would just like to see the list of names of people who voted on my behalf. I could not get that list except from Wikipedia. I could not get it from the state party. The Republican Party does have it posted, but when I asked who are they, could not answer my question. So it is really a hall of mirrors, but it doesn't have to be that way. If the voters are educated enough to realize they have ceded all of their power in their state electoral votes to the political parties on their behalf, I think they can take that power back and pass some ballot initiatives and some reforms that will make those votes in their state more representative. So I think the power is ours. I think we're Americans. I don't think, we can change our destiny. So I'm very hopeful.
Having been involved in this, by the way, I have to note that I can tell you who these people are. These people are people that you are absolutely certain will be faithful and will vote the way you want them to vote if you happen to carry the state.
I know who they are too. I just did it as a test, just to pretend that I was your average voter, and I wanted to know. And I got put on hold an awful lot.
I'd agree with Ralph here that, and also that it's a virtual impossibility that you would have a constitutional amendment to overturn the Electoral College. But I think it's also important to take a step back and say why we have an Electoral College, right? This is one of the many checks and balances which understands that we're not America. We are the United States of America. And if we're the United States of America, there are going to be parts of the system, whether it's 2 senators per state or the Electoral College, that really are not democratic in the pure sense of that term. There are filters by which smaller states, and being part of this larger compact of the United States of America, this Constitution, are seeking at least somewhat equal representation. I think there is something to be said for that proportional division of votes. But to your point, there would have to be a compact along those terms. I would not support the compact as it related to what's known as the national popular vote, in the sense that you might have a state and its electors decide differently than its voters did, even if that was different than the national vote total. But if you were able to pass something of a compact that incorporated this proportional representation, then I could foresee if you set the limits to say that you were going to get to 45 or 40 states that were going to sign on to it, and certain states, whether it had to be California and Texas, would sign on to it, you could have something there that I think would be more representative.
I think there are 2 things to note. One is that the Electoral College bears absolutely no resemblance in its functioning to what the founders intended. They did not design what we are using. They had, I believe, 3 elections we had at the beginning of this country, the first 2 for George Washington and the second for John Adams, where it worked as intended, which is to say that the leading citizens of every state, selected by the legislature, got together and decided who they thought ought to be president. Aside from the legislature, aside from any votes by citizens, it was the point was it was an outside group that would select the president. That stopped after the 3rd election. We ended up with political parties. You had Jefferson v. Adams, and from then on, you had a totally different system, which is now one where the electors are selected depending on the popular vote in every state. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying it is important to remember that what we have was designed for a different system and a different country than where we are. So that's point 1. Point 2, I agree that despite that, everyone is now sufficiently invested in what we have. Other reasons have arisen to retain it. The small states feel that they are overrepresented in the college compared to what they'd be if it was the popular vote. You also have, the country is polarized on many issues. One of them has become the Electoral College versus the popular vote, because there was nobody in the 20th century who was elected without winning by the Electoral College, without winning the popular vote. We've had 2 in the 21st century, George W. Bush and Donald Trump. One effect of that is that Republican support for the Electoral College has risen because they like that result, and they see a attack on it as an attack on the legitimacy of those elections. So I think I agree with the view that says we're not going to be able to get rid of the Electoral College by constitutional amendment. We are sufficiently polarized that that does not have a chance. However, I believe we can still fix the Electoral College, and there are two things I would do to fix it. And I think those could be by constitutional amendment, because I don't believe either would be controversial or seen as partisan. One is we have the problem referred to earlier of what's called a faithless elector, which means the state goes for candidate X, the electors pledge to candidate X, vote, and one of them doesn't vote for X. There was pressure this time on Trump electors not to vote for Trump. In the past, there have been electors who cast protest votes or voted for a third-party candidate, and that's clearly, ironically, it's what the Constitution says, because it goes back to that idea the electors were going to be wise citizens, but it's not the way it works now, and we would be outraged as a country if faithless electors were to tip an election to the other side. So my proposal would be to get rid of the electors, leave the Electoral College, but there is no reason to have, whatever it is, 50-some people from California actually casting votes. You could simply say California has X number of votes in the Electoral College. They shall automatically be considered cast for the winner of the popular vote in that state. And you could do that state by state. You don't have to have physical electors there who are a time bomb, I think, waiting to go off. The other, which I personally think would be sufficiently supported by both parties to work, is the idea of proportional representation, where you'd say that the votes cast by a state will be in proportion to the citizens' vote in that state. And I don't think it works through a compact, because you run into these problems of what happens if some states join and some don't, and it's not really something that is easy to enforce. But if you had a constitutional amendment that said that, you suddenly put all the states into play, and California and Texas get treated equally. The Democrats get votes out of Texas, the Republicans get votes out of California. It seems to me that that might be something that would solve an underlying political problem while still leaving the smaller states with the representation they have. So I think that might be worth looking at.
Ralph wants a brief comment, he's told me, and then I have a quick follow-up, and we're going to move on.
One point I want to underscore, Leslie was talking about someone who does not get a majority or most votes doesn't get it. The other point with respect to the Electoral College, we want to maximize citizen participation, and we want candidates to campaign in all 50 states, or as many as possible. As I was studying for this event, I came across a startling statistic. In the 2016 presidential election, the general election, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, 70% of their campaign appearances were in 6 states. 94% of their campaign appearances were in 12 states. That means about 40 states were ignored by the presidential candidates in the general election. That's not something we want to continue. We want to have them out there in as many states as possible in getting as many citizens as possible involved in voting.
Quick follow-up, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's occurred to me when I've thought about this electoral compact, and if you have 270 people sign up to it, they'll all vote for the winner of the popular vote. Wouldn't you then, to make sure that you don't have people fooling around with the voting processes in various states in a close election, wouldn't you have to have some kind of uniform federal standard for the voting for president? Otherwise, you could have an election like 2000, where where everybody knows it's going to be very, very close, and there's a huge incentive for people to try to cheat.
But that was what was supposed to happen with HAVA, right? The Help Americans to Vote Act, which was passed 2 years after the 2000 election, was really supposed to standardize that. And what you found, I know this as a former Secretary of State candidate, is that California, for example, was the last state not to have a statewide voter roll. And so the implementation of HAVA, which really was intended to get much more standardized on voting equipment and the condition of voter rolls and those kinds of things, was really not well enforced.
So you would agree that you would have to have something like that on a national level in order to make sure that the votes were honestly cast and counted.
I wouldn't agree that it was necessary to do that. I would support it because it's right.
Anybody else?
Well, all I'd say is that I think for the 12 states in play now, there's huge incentive already to play with those numbers. I don't think that is occurring. I think our election system is by and large not subject to fraud. It may be subject to incompetence, as we found in Florida in 2000. And I agree that I think the Congress has worked since then to try to improve the voting systems, at least.
I would also say on this note, as one of 3 Republicans who lives in Santa Monica, that
the People's Republic of Santa Monica?
That one of I think, the positive externalities of looking at this, whether it's proportional representation or looking at reform in the area of the Electoral College, is I know that on presidential election cycles, my vote really doesn't count. And the impact of that for a lot of other people, I vote anyway because that's what I do, and a lot of people do. But what happens in the down ticket races that are underneath that presidential, that ticket, I think we don't yet know what that would be. What would it mean for Democrats in Texas to understand that, you know what, actually your vote may actually have an impact at that top of the ticket, and now you're going in and you've got 15 other things to vote for. How's it going to impact that? And I think one of the things here in California that I think really is worth observing is as we have a larger conversation around what does it take to get more people to turn out, is understanding that in a lot of these landslide states, which if you look at the 2016 election, all the landslide states had the lowest voter turnout because people like me understood that, quite frankly, there was really no purpose to casting a vote for president if I wasn't going to vote for the Democratic nominee.
That's why I think the proportional idea of splitting the Electoral College votes by vote in the state really radically changes that. It empowers you here.
Well, either of these would. I think it's quite interesting. For example, the Hispanic turnout in Texas is pretty low. Democrats don't put as much effort in as they might to get that turnout up because they don't think they're going to carry Texas, so that may change over the next 8 years. If every vote counted, people would put a lot more effort into turning those folks out. Now, speaking of every vote counted or being counted, and every voter being able to vote, turn this back to Adam for a minute.
Yes, exactly. I'm wondering if we need federal protections to encourage people to get people out to vote. Is there any prospect that a law like that could be passed in this hyper-partisan era?
Well, we have the voting rights laws already passed in the 60s to ensure that people can vote regardless of their race, because that was the original issue in the 60s, were states attempting to discourage or prevent minorities from voting. And of course, that's an open battle today. I think many people say that that's what's happening in some of the southern states that have adopted these draconian, one-sided voter ID measures, where in Texas, for instance, you have to have photo ID to vote, and then there's a list of what's an acceptable photo ID, and the legislature, in its wisdom, decided that a concealed weapon carry permit was a permissible voter ID, but a photo ID issued by the state of Texas to its university students was not. That is designed, I think, fairly to make sure that students vote at a lower rate and that people who are NRA members vote at a higher rate. That's a problem, not photo ID per se, but a system that is designed to discourage some blocks of voters from voting. And those are in the federal courts now. They've been struck down in a number of places. So I think the answer to the question is we have laws that should ensure that people are treated equally. We just need to make sure we enforce those.
Ralph, you were involved forever in the Voting Rights Act. I actually remember working with you on it. So what do you think of that? Do we need a stronger Voting Rights Act, a restored Voting Rights Act?
That was the first issue that you and I worked with Senator Edward Kennedy back in 1981 and 1982. And thanks to Senator Kennedy's leadership with strong bipartisan support, the Voting Rights Act was extended for 25 years and subsequently extended for a while in 2006. A strong Voting Rights Act. What happened, however, and Trevor did reference this a bit, with respect to the Shelby County case in 2013. And Chief Justice John Roberts, who was fighting us at that time when he was at the Department of Justice on the Voting Rights Act, basically gutted the Section 4, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act with respect to the Department of Justice jurisdiction over states who were covered because of their past history of discrimination against African Americans and Latinos and others. There is legislation, Adam, in the House and the Senate. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that Lisa Murkowski, Republican from Alaska, might be the only Republican in the Senate, and Representative Jim Senserman, a conservative Republican from Wisconsin, who was an absolute hero back in 1981 and 1982, are the sponsors. You cannot pass legislation these days, or at any time really, with two Republican sponsors in votes for it. So I'm not optimistic with respect to federal legislation at this time to overturn that Supreme Court decision. Will it happen someday? I hope, but the political dynamics are going to have to change, and we're going to have to do a massive public education work on that. So not in the short term.
Anybody else on this? Okay, I have a bit of an off-the-wall question I want to ask you. There's something called ranked choice voting. Could you explain what it is, and do you think it's a good idea?
Ranked choice voting, which is now in about 10 cities across the country, affecting about 2 million voters, is getting traction, not just in these 10 cities in the state of Maine with respect to congressional races. There's ranked choice voting. Essentially, what it is that voters get to rank their candidates in order of their preference. So let's just say there are 4 candidates in the general election, and you rate them 1, 2, 3, 4. Once someone of those 4 gets a majority of the first place votes, that person is the winner. A majority vote, which is something I think most of us want.
They might get to a majority by having second and third preferences.
This is how it works. This is exactly how it works. So what happens if there's not a majority? The person who finished last is eliminated. And that person's second place votes are redistributed to the other 3 candidates. And if you have a majority winner at the end of that ballot, then that's it. But the process continues of eliminating the last place finisher and redistributing votes. So that's how you get to someone who's got a majority of the votes and gets all those electors. And what's important about it, it encourages the candidates to be civil to one another, to reach out not just to your base, but you've got to be civil and much less negative advertising, because you want to be the second choice of those people who vote for another candidate. So it encourages pragmatic elected officials, people who are going to reach out to an expanded base. It's more civil. It costs less. There's a lot to be said about it. We have not yet taken a position, Leslie, but we're positioning ourselves for a rather vigorous debate. And my guess is there are going to be lots of support as more and more people find out about this, because it helps eliminate that political polarization, extreme partisanship. It's got a lot of merit. I think we're both looking forward to that debate.
I would just jump in. It's an interesting notion. It can be very confusing to the voter.
Isn't that just confusing, by the way? Just throw that out there.
So that's a bit of a concern, because you don't want to discourage voting. You want a plan that's very clear, very easy to understand.
So you're telling me under this system I would have had to cast a vote for Donald Trump?
No, you could have gone for
fourth. I would have had to rank him.
But perhaps somebody like Bloomberg would have gotten in the race, and maybe more people would have picked him as number 2. I think the positive aspect is you are voting for someone as opposed to against them, which would be the positive way to look at it. The question is it just too overwhelming for the voter? They did it in Minnesota. They interviewed people coming out. They said it wasn't so bad. I would love to see a physical ballot and see how it really looks when you come out of the voting booth. But I think this notion that you are voting for someone is a positive idea, as opposed to voting against. So those are the pluses and minuses. But I do think it takes a lot of explaining.
It does, and I would just add, I mean, with a lot of these electoral reform issues, there are things where you can make a decision to move forward on it because you believe it's the right thing to do, the most representative of an election result. There are other things that you're doing to hopefully also increase participation. And at least what we've seen thus far in the cities that have used it is we're not seeing a great uptick in participation. We're talking about cities like Oakland and others that, quite frankly, you're still looking at 20, 25, 30% participation in mayoral races. And another question then becomes, how far down the ballot do you go? I mean, I'm lucky if I know 3 of the 5 judicial appointments that I have to vote on every cycle. And so it has been, I think, confusing, but I do see it as something that's gaining some momentum, and we will see at least other municipalities sign on to experiment with it.
Trevor, do you want to say something on that, or we have another question for you that I think Adam's going to ask you?
Well, I guess the question I'd have on ranked choice voting, because I told Ralph before we started that I was looking forward to hearing the explanation because I'm still trying to understand it, is what do you do in a race where there's a Republican and a Democratic candidate and that's it? You don't use it, then I take it.
In effect, you would not have to, right? One of them is going to get a majority of the first place.
But the more likely thing, for example, is that in that situation, it encourages other people to run, i.e. Michael Bloomberg, for example, in 2016, I think under ranked choice voting might very well have run.
And this is a really important vote. And it's in this audience and among these panelists, it addresses the spoiler issue. You can vote for who you want to vote and not feel that by casting a vote for Bloomberg or for some other in a normal election, you are having the possibility of someone you really oppose being the beneficiary of your vote because it's a spoiler effect. This eliminates it because in the end, there'll be one person who gets a majority of the votes. There are no spoilers.
I think Adam has a question for Trevor, and we're going to change the topic a little bit.
Yeah, directed to you, Trevor. Our political system is drowning in money. We see the super PAC spending numbers. And just to the layman, I'm interested, is this a good or bad thing that so much money is in politics these days?
So, in all due respect and not as a criticism, I will actually say I think that's the wrong question because it costs money to run, it costs money to communicate, it costs money to buy, whether it's Facebook ads or television time or consultants. So yes, we're spending a huge amount of money in elections. It's much more than we used to spend. Republicans who oppose campaign finance reform will say, yes, but we spend more buying popcorn or potato chips or something. So that's why I think if you get sidetracked on the issue of is there too much money or too little, and then you say, well, but who's the government to tell you how much you can spend and so forth, you end up in an unproductive conversation. It seems to me the conversation needs to be a couple things. First, where is this money coming from? And how do office holders what do they have to do to get it? Is the system becoming corrupt? And if so, how do we fix it? Let's assume everybody needs money to communicate. Does that come from a tiny handful of donors? Does that come from a broad base of popular support? We used to have a public funding system for the presidential election in this country. Ronald Reagan ran and won under that system. So it's not anti-conservative, but that's gone now. Instead, we have reports that members of Congress are spending 40% of their working time fundraising in little booths, dialing for dollars, trying to figure out how to get enough money to run their campaigns. And we have what you've referenced, which is the new world of super PACs, where as a result of a couple court decisions, including the Supreme Court Citizens United, we've ended up where instead of having contribution limits on what can be given to candidates and therefore spent, we have a world with no contribution limits to these super PACs, which are therefore funded literally by a handful of people. If you look in the last election, 70-80% of the money to the super PACs came from about 100 Americans. And those become the major players. So it seems to me what we need to be looking at is how to diversify the funding, how to make office holders, candidates, but really office holders, less reliant on the whims of a couple rich people, and instead find a way to finance those elections from a much broader base and provide alternative sources of money to compete with the millionaires.
Yeah, I just tee off on that, Trevor's point about where the money comes from. I remember when I was running for office back in 2014, as someone who's never run for office before, one of the things that was so surprising was this difference between individual contributions and these associations and PACs that were involved. And I remember at one point during the campaign, we had a little graphic up during the general election cycle in which we were able to show that about 80% of our funding had come from individuals and 20% from associations, whereas my opponent, 80% of the money was coming from associations and PACs and those kinds of organized fundraising groups, and 20% was coming from individuals. And I think if we were to have this conversation before the 16th cycle, it'd be a little different, right? We had Trump, who was outraised, still won, and I think everybody in this room probably knows to the penny what the exact average donation was to Bernie Sanders' campaign, right? $27, right? And so I think nobody had any qualms, and I certainly didn't, with Bernie Sanders raising tens and millions of dollars, but they were coming in these little $27 snippets. And so one of the things that I proposed during the campaign was that even if we were to just report during the campaign, if the media were just trained to report that with every fundraising total, they would put in parentheses how much came from individuals and how much came from associations or PACs, I think at least we'd have a little bit better awareness of where this money was coming from. I'm sure most of the people in this room are not familiar with something called the Third House. Now, the Third House in Sacramento, if you're a Californian, dominates the fundraising and campaign cash for any California legislative or gubernatorial candidate. And if you don't know that that's where a lot of that money is coming from, then you really don't have a sense of who's pulling some of the levers here politically in the state of California. And I think there are some things we can do just from a transparency and reporting perspective that people really wouldn't care if a candidate raised $100 million if it was in $27, amounts versus one candidate getting $80 million from a rather shadowy super PAC and a much smaller amount coming from individuals.
Leslee or Ralph, any prospect for campaign finance reform?
I think there's a prospect at the national level and certainly at the state level along the lines of what we're talking about, these transparency and disclosure laws. If those would go in effect, as Peter's just said, I think that would be enormously consequential. Also, the enforcement of existing laws. That's, as the FTC former chair would be the first to not only acknowledge but make an emphatic point. We've got to enforce the laws. The other thing is, how do you get those $27 average donors? And there are some really good proposals, whether it's tax credits or whether it's rebates, matching funds. There's a lot at the state level right now that I think would facilitate the little person or the average person getting involved in a much more significant way, and the Bernie Sanders campaign would not be an exception to the rule. We could have the local and the state and national leaders doing that in terms of what they would support.
Adam, if I could just add on the disclosure side, because I think that really is important. What's changed in these elections is that we now have significant sums of money, hundreds of millions of dollars of money, that is being spent without disclosure. Ever since the 1970s, the one guarantee is that the money will be disclosed at the state level and the federal level. But we now have groups that are not disclosing their donors because they say we're not political committees, so we don't have to. We're under the tax code, 501c4s or 6s. And therefore, they are able to step in without anyone knowing who's doing the spending. They don't tell anyone in this room that they're paying for these ads. So you see the ads and it says, paid for by Better America. No idea who that is. The latest iteration, which came out this week and is very California-based, is the Facebook scandal. This discovery by Facebook that they were selling advertisements to Russian front entities. And they have announced that they have now found this. Today's announcement was it's not just advertising, but it was also all sorts of meet-up groups that were able to use the Facebook apparatus to come up with protests over immigration and other issues. Foreign money is illegal in U.S. elections, but what we're now being told is there's no disclosure of it. Facebook isn't
you'll never
even
know.
Facebook isn't telling us any of the details, and they're not showing us the ads that were paid for and watched. The estimate is that up to 70 million Americans would have seen these ads that we are now being told we can't see. So I think this whole disclosure issue is a really important one.
I want to turn this over to the audience in a minute, but I want to go over one other issue. Redistricting in the form of gerrymandering seems to profoundly influence representation, balance of power, the electoral process. There's a case challenging the gerrymandering before the Supreme Court. Comes out of Wisconsin. What's the argument here? Is the case likely to be decided on a, quote, party line vote of the Supreme Court justices? And if the court doesn't do anything, is it likely that more and more states might try to politicize redistricting, as Arnold Schwarzenegger did here in California?
Short answer on the Wisconsin case, because that's the one brought by my group, the Campaign Legal Center. We argued it in Wisconsin, and we'll argue it before the court next month, is that is a challenge to overly partisan what's called gerrymandering, drawing lines to favor one party and make sure that the other doesn't get a majority. It has been illegal for some time to district lines to hurt minorities, but it has not been considered unconstitutional to do so to hurt the other party. So what you have is people in government ensuring that their party maintains control by choosing their voters rather than the voters choosing the candidates. And California has had reform and nonpartisan redistricting. The case out of Wisconsin comes from a state legislature. In this case, it was the Republican Party that did it, but the state right south of them, Illinois, the Democrats do exactly the same thing. So in my view, this is not a partisan issue. This is a basic government right issue, our right to be able to elect representatives without having those districts handpicked and drawn. The short answer in Wisconsin is this was a Republican gerrymander. They used computers, and they came up with the most Republican legislature they could think of drawing these lines. And the result in 2012 is that 49% of voters in Wisconsin voted for Republicans, and the legislature that was elected by that 49% was 60% Republican. So they got a result through gerrymandering that they did not get at the polls. And it, again, happens exactly the other way in Illinois, Maryland. Massachusetts has not had a Republican congressman in 20 years. 30% of the state votes for Republicans. So this is a problem that I think needs to be addressed by the Supreme Court. I'm hopeful that it will not be a so-called party line vote. Justice Kennedy is the swing justice here, and he has indicated that he thinks that overly partisan gerrymandering is wrong, but he has said we need a test so that we're not being subjective when we look at it. And our goal in the Wisconsin case is to say that there is a test. The numbers that I have described are an example of how you can prove that this was overly partisan. So this case will be argued in October, decided probably next spring, and I'm hopeful that we will then be able to change the standard nationwide.
Anyone else on this?
Well, I'd just say that the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, I think, does show a way. I mean, it's definitely something that I am supportive of. It just a little modification. It wasn't nonpartisan. It was actually multipartisan. So the members were of that everyday California citizens, 30,000 of whom applied to be on the commission, were divided by Republicans, Democrats, and no party preference. And so there was equal representation, even more so than party registration. There was more equal representation for someone like myself as a Republican on that redistricting commission than you would find elsewhere, certainly in the legislature. And so I think those kinds of processes which were being shown, and that has withstood many court challenges, those maps have, and they're still the maps we're using today. I think that does provide a model for other states.
I would just only add, when looking at electoral reform in Maine and Nebraska, where it's the congressional district model, that just begs for more gerrymandering. So when you're looking at various reforms, the congressional district model, unless the gerrymandering is fixed, will only continue to breed a gaming of the system. So to get back to Trevor's point of eliminating the people and just dealing with the numbers, again, you could sidestep the gerrymandering until it's fixed. And I don't know as though you'll ever completely get away from it, but that's one way around it, certainly.
Point of personal privilege. Having been a citizen of Massachusetts, Trevor, I think if you gave and Ralph knows this too, if you gave the Republicans complete control of the legislature and the governorship, they still couldn't gerrymander the state. It'd be very difficult to elect a Republican congressman because the Republicans tend to be rather evenly spread across the state.
I think we're all looking for bipartisanship and nonpartisanship. I think it's important. In the last month, there's been some significant bipartisanship on automatic voter registration, which we'll talk about perhaps in the Q&A. But on your case, Trevor, I think it's important for me to acknowledge what you all have done with your allies in terms of former Republican senators, governors, Republican governors, and also in the Congress, John McCain, a conservative, Nancy Pelosi, a liberal, and Mark Meadow, the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, one of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives, all signed on to briefs in support of your position. So that's something we should acknowledge, applaud, and hopefully we get more of it.
So we have a tradition here which is going to be upheld. We turn this over, I hope, for the last 15 minutes or so to the audience. So anybody has a question, please raise your hands. And because of the lights, I can't see very well, but someone here has a microphone. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, folks. Kami Akavon of procon.org. My question for you is, you're talking a lot about the rules of how elections are run and inputs into the election. And my question is, if you do all those kinds of changes to rules in your fantasy world, the ideal situation that you would see, would it change our voter participation rate from, say, 20, 30%, 40% to 80 or 90%? And if not, how do you get to 80 or 90%? Are we talking about rules? Are we talking about something bigger? And how do we address those bigger things?
I would just jump in and say, if you get rid of winner take all, you will have much more voter participation. I mean, I think California is a perfect example. I know many Democrats who never bothered to go to the polls this time around. A lot of Republicans didn't bother. Same is true in Texas, Oklahoma. But if people thought they had a shot at least being somewhat represented, you had 12 states this time around where neither candidate got 50%, but they got 100% of the electoral vote. That is not representative. We still do have a representative form of government, and anytime somebody doesn't get 50%, but they get 100% of the of the Electoral College, it's everybody knows it's just not right. So I think the number one voter suppression is winner take all, for sure. And so I would venture to guess people would be fighting tooth and nail to get to a chance to vote if they thought it mattered more.
I slipped in automatic voter registration a few minutes ago, hoping that it would come as a question from the audience. If we have automatic voter registration, which means basically when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, you can be automatically registered, or another kind of federal state agency, 50 million more Americans will be registered if we have automatic voter registration. 10 states in the last 2 years, as recently as August, that's the other bipartisan success, Bruce Rauner, the Republican governor of Illinois, signed into a law that was passed unanimously in Illinois, automatic voter registration. That's number one. Number two, it would be nice to get those tens of millions of Americans who are independents able to vote in primaries. Somehow we got to figure out a way to preserve the party system, but also get people who are going to be affected by those nominees of the parties involved in the primaries somehow. Thirdly, how about a voter participation holiday? Maybe it's Veterans Day. Every time there's a presidential election, there is a federal holiday, but we don't have to create a new one. Veterans Day happens to be within a week or so of the vote. That would mean the convenience of voting. That's what so much of this voter participation is. How do you make it easy for people? Not just voter suppression, but an incentive to be able to vote and giving people the time to vote and making it easy to register. That would make an enormous difference in getting that 60, 70, 80% over time as people get more comfortable with it.
Ralph, I was ready to agree with you on everything tonight, but I have to push back a little. I think that many of these levers that can improve registration don't necessarily improve voter turnout. Those are two very different things. And at least some of the political science research, a friend of mine, Eric McGee, who's up at the Public Policy Institute of California, did some research back in 2014 looking at some of these measures that are meant to increase registration. Do they actually increase turnout, whether it's same-day registration or extending the period for which absentee ballots can be submitted, or extending the period back from election day earlier to which votes can be cast. And on an array of these measures, you're looking at 1%, 2%, 3% effect. I think some of the bigger issues are what you're talking about thinking about, at least on presidential election years, whether the votes of people in these landslide winner-take-all states are going to have an impact. I think that can really play a role in changing voter turnout. But I also think that there's a bigger issue that's being dictated here by the number, especially of millennials, who are not registering for either party, and they're registering no party preference. And in that, looking also at that demographic and overall at no party preference voters, you're seeing voters that turn out at lower levels than party registered voters. And I think those two things together, to me, speak to actually a bigger problem of the soul, if you will, of the voter. I think that there's a growing sense that our politics are becoming disconnected from the people. And I think when that begins to happen, when people just think politics is parties and parties are bad and the whole system is corrupt and it's an insider game, that's going to have a much bigger impact on turnout when you're looking at an election, which even in this 2016 race, one of the larger turnouts we've seen in the last 2 decades, 60% of registered voters turn out. What about the 40%? In a lot of these voter registration issues, we're looking at making these 2, 3, 4% changes, and we're losing sight of this 40 to 50% large group of eligible voters who I think in many ways are voting with their feet.
Another question.
We'll take one more. Maybe it'll prompt. Okay, thank you. My name is Michelle Herzog. I'm proud to serve on the ProCon board, and my work during the day is to try to instill the importance of voting to young people while they're still in school. And unfortunately, I'm not hearing a lot that's helping our case. But I'm thinking about election night when we're all glued to the TV and the results start rolling in. And, often results come in so loud and strong before us West Coasters, polls are closed. And then there's Hawaii and Alaska. Do you think that has any impact on voter turnout? And is there anything we can
address that as somebody who worked at a network, and we had a lot of criticism for that, and got pulled in front of the Congress to discuss that issue because during the Reagan-Carter race, it was over before Californian polls were even closed, and they had actually called the election. So what they do now is they put them in a decision room, the doors are closed, no one's supposed to know what their modeling is showing as the precincts and districts come in. They will never call an election before the last poll has closed in Hawaii. That's the rule. However, as the tallies start to come in, you sense a momentum. When a close election where people are still waiting on Michigan like they were this time around, Pennsylvania, other states, it's more of a cliffhanger. I don't know whether that affects the West Coast so much. But there's very little you can do once the polls close in a state to tell them they can't report those numbers. They will no longer call those elections. And in 2000 was also another issue where Florida was called, then it was pulled back. Again, those decision desks are now supposed to be kept sequestered from the anchors. And so they've done things from a media standpoint to try to avoid it, but it is very difficult to do. And the exit polling comes out, and those are not supposed to be leaked until the polls close. But a lot of that information does get out. I don't know whether it really suppresses votes necessarily, or has people just say, well, why bother? It's sort of over. I think at least not calling it until the last poll is closed does help somewhat.
I'm not sure the Hawaii, Alaska standard, from my experience,
it's usually
is
California,
always observed.
but yeah, no,
I think
they
it's
do
California.
jump in.
Another question, hopefully from a student. Great.
Hi, my name is Katie. I'm a sophomore. I'm a student here at USC. The comment about the media got me thinking, do you think if these issues such as electoral reform and gerrymandering got more media coverage, like they're not as like sexy or exciting as breaking news alerts or that kind of thing, but if they did and people got more invested, like citizens got more invested in these issues and saw the impact that this type of voter suppression has on like their day-to-day lives, do you think that could help fuel like legislative motion into getting your ideas into place quicker?
I do. I think the media will only pay attention if it's really noisy and loud. So I think the voters have to be very noisy and loud and say they're fed up. Look at all the free media Donald Trump got in this election. He didn't have to buy any ads because they go to the noise. And I do not mean to disparage my fellow journalists, but I also know CNN's never made more money in their life than they did in this. The first time they've been in the black in a really long time. So it really has to be a grassroots effort. And it has, like Bernie and the $27 voter, it caught everybody off surprise. It was very exciting. There was momentum. It has to start with voters saying they've had enough. And people are really apathetic, and the low voter turnout is part of that problem. But, people have got to get angry.
And I would say, too, it does demand somebody on the inside of the system pushing the issue. If you look back at the history of the Citizens Redistricting Commission here in California, it was led by Governor Schwarzenegger. And that phrase, Trevor, I just remember Governor Schwarzenegger saying so many times on the campaign trail while he was campaigning for the proposition that passed, which was, we're supposed to be the ones as voters picking our politicians, not our politicians picking our voters. So he was able to distill what was really a very complex ballot measure. I mean, if you look at the way that the Citizens Redistricting Commission was put together and how people applied and how they were vetted and all those things, very complex. But when Governor Schwarzenegger was able to distill it down to that very simple populist message, which is, are we as voters, are we the ones that get to pick our politicians rather than they choosing us? It really did win the day. So I think a simple populist message driven by somebody on the inside is loud enough to get the press's attention, and it can change the way we do things.
I would agree. I think strong, visible leadership on any of these issues is the ticket to success. And you can't sit here and say, well, the press should cover this more or that more. Those of us who are in the field spend our days trying to figure out ways to get press attention or how to explain the story in a way that is non-traditional or use non-traditional social media to explain what's at stake here and what the issues are. But certainly if you're going to try to push for change, whether it's electoral college change or campaign finance, I think you've got to have somebody like Governor Schwarzenegger, who, by the way, has been very strong nationally on this issue. But you have to have someone like that in the Congress or in the states to raise it up to a level of visibility so that people hear about it.
Ralph, as the Gospels say, the first shall be last. Do you have a last comment?
I just want to make the point, not just about the nonpartisanship, the bipartisanship, but what you've heard just in the last few minutes, it's got to be in the states. In the beginning, it is important to have national leadership and state leadership. We have to, all of us, build an election reform movement. We have to organize in the states and explain to people what's at stake. I think about the spirit of Houston and Texas and Louisiana over the last couple of weeks in response to the hurricanes, and people of all colors and political persuasions and creeds working together in a common purpose. That's what we need with respect to an election reform movement. We're a resilient and great nation. We can take on this challenge when people understand our democracy is truly at stake.
So I have to have one last comment, Leslie, in terms of what you were saying. The president of one of the networks observed during 2016, Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's very, very good for my bottom line.
Bingo.
So I think these issues of opening up the process, of getting more people to vote, will actually, if we can ever get there, will actually give us better results. I don't mean Democratic results or Republican results, but better results across the board if more people participate. That's the idea of democracy. I want to thank Ralph. I want to thank Leslie, Pete, Trevor, Adam Grushin, my co-moderator, and I want to mostly thank the students here at USC who are engaged, interested, stimulating, terrific people, and I like being a teacher here very much. I also want to thank the staff of the Unruh Institute, which does a fabulous job week after week. We'll see you here next week to talk about the shrinking middle class. Thanks, everybody.